In my view, tonight's subject is becoming increasingly more important for us as the standards of the world's relationships fall further and further away from those of Scripture, and sadly many of our marriages are also being affected as well. So initially I'd like to turn to Ephesians chapter 5, which will lead us to the foundation principles of marriage that are established in the Garden of Eden. And then we'll reflect on how both Peter and Paul, build on these principles. And as we progress, we'll try and consider some practical examples that arise, and then also reflect on how we ought to perhaps conduct ourselves in our own marriages. So turn with me to Ephesians chapter 5, if you would, and verse 21, where our subject title is taken from. And there we read, "Submit yourselves one to another in the fear of God." And there's a specific instruction for wives in verse 22. "Wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands as unto the Lord." And then in verse 25, the husbands are also addressed. "Love your wives, even as Christ also loved the ecclesia and gave himself for it." It perhaps goes without saying that the environment of the Ephesian ecclesia would have influenced greatly this epistle. Ephesus was a major coastal Roman city in Asia, and it would have been hugely influenced by the wisdom and the learning of Greek philosophy, being dominated by the pagan, immoral temple of Diana, which overlooked the city from a hilltop, and it was run purely by women, priests, and it was largely funded by their prostitution. And so we can imagine what kind of environment this would be. And in many ways it's very similar to ours, being rather unsavoury to say the least. Today we are affected by human rights. We are affected by women's rights, modernism, postmodernism, which suggests everyone is entitled to their own opinion, to express it, and everyone is equally right. There is no right or wrong from the postmodernist point of view. When we stand back from the epistle of the Ephesians as a whole, it seems to me that Paul explains the hope and the aspirations that he has for his brethren and sisters in the first few chapters of Ephesians. And then he tries to address their weaknesses in the following chapters. So Paul opens the epistle in chapter 1 and verse 2 with the very powerful words, to me, grace and peace. They include us, of course, through, there is a qualification, chapter 2 and verse 13, the blood of the Lamb. And when you ponder these words, I find an incredible depth of love expressed here. For us, brothers and sisters, peace is the shalom, a deep peace in our hearts and minds now, through the comfort and assurance of the Word. But ultimately it speaks of the true eternal peace of the millennium, doesn't it? Then if you turn to chapter 3 and verse 14, we find he bows his knee. And in verse 17, he prays that Christ may dwell in our hearts by faith, that we, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and the length and the depth and the height. There's an allusion to the Diana temple, I believe. And to know the love of Christ which passeth understanding, that we might be filled with all the fullness of God. This was Paul's clear objective for the Ephesians, and for us. Every word is rich, isn't it? Powerful and full of meaning. Deeply profound words when you ponder them. His prayer is that the love of the Master might dwell in our hearts in all its fullness. And so that might be achieved, he then goes on to address a number of weaknesses that they might have in the following 3 chapters. And so when we reflect on the words of chapter 5, requiring submission to one another within our marriages, within our ecclesias, all our relationships, it's essential for the fullness of God and the mind of Christ to dwell within us properly. Just as an aside, turning into Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, I know most of us know this, but Paul there advises, and be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And transformed, as I'm sure you're aware, has the idea of metamorphosis, which is a complete change from one thing to another, from the fleshly selfish way of thinking to that of the selfless spirit mind. But importantly, notice it is a process that Paul expects us to put in place, which starts with the renewing and renovation of our minds and followed by our moral behaviour. And it's clear from these words that Paul believed we do have a choice in these things. We do have a choice in the way we think. We do have a choice in the things that we do and the way that we behave. But moving back to Ephesians, we find Paul in chapter 5 and verse 21 through to chapter 6 and verse 9 makes what might appear to be a disproportionately large issue of submitting one to another. And so surely the size of that reflects on how important it was that we submit one to the other, to him. And in verse 21 and verse 22, the word submit is the same in the Greek, which essentially means to set in order underneath one another. And Paul then explains how he expects this to happen. Firstly, verse 22, wives are to submit to their husbands. Verse 24, in the same way that the ecclesia ought to the master. And in verse 25, husbands are to love their wives as the master loved the ecclesia in giving his life for them. And notice that Paul spends more time on the husband submitting in his responsibility to the wife than the other way around. There's a disproportionate amount of time placed on the husband, for it continues true to the end of the chapter in verse 33. Verse 23, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as the master is the head of the ecclesia, and he is the saviour of the body. So we see that the husband was to be the head, in the same way that the master is of the ecclesia, which is rather different to the way that the world sees it, isn't it? And importantly, verse 24 does say in everything. And the Greek word does mean in everything, anything, all things, the whole. And as the master was the saviour of the body, so similarly the husband should be in submission, provide for the spiritual and physical deliverance of his wife and family, even to the giving of his life, as the master did. And I wonder sometimes, having lost my wife, whether we think about that enough and what that actually means. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 1 through to 3 though and see where these principles are derived. Chapter 1 of Genesis. There we find in chapter 1 of verse 26 that God decides to make man, which includes both male and female, according to verse 27. Verse 26 suggests that both were made in the image of the Elohim. Image in this context implies the same visible form. And so we understand that there are both male and female looking Elohim. They were also made in the likeness of the Elohim, which refers to their mental capacities. And so we understand that Adam and Eve were both very similar to one another in their mental capacity and interestingly, to the Elohim. And so both were equally able to absorb spiritual principles and to develop the same spiritual mind of the Father as the Elohim. And it's rather obvious, isn't it, that there's a difference between man and wife. Otherwise he wouldn't have described them differently. Then we notice that there is an order between them. It's male, then female. And interestingly, there's a comment that was made. This was a comment that was made before they came to marriage, which was sanctioned in verse 28. Verse 27 also indicates that they both share the same responsibility and dominion over the earth and all that therein is. So we find that there are some things in which both male and female are equally and completely equal in, but there are other things in which there is an order, a divine order. According to verse 31, both Adam and Eve were made on the sixth day. And in chapter 2 and verse 7 we see that Adam was formed out of the ground. And in verse 18 of chapter 2 we find one of the principal reasons for their marriage and why Eve was created in a different way. It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helpmeet. And help does mean help. But meet has an idea of companionship and is something which is parallel or alongside, facing, or an opposite. And so she was to be a suitable, complementary opposite, helping companion in the responsibilities that the Father had given Adam. In verse 21 we read how she was formed. And Yahweh God caused a deep sleep fall upon Adam, and he slept, and he took one of his ribs. Verse 22, and from the rib he made a woman, and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman. In other words, out of man. So we see that Adam's companion was much more than just a mate. She was to have a special relationship with her husband that the animals just simply don't have. And having been taken out of the side of Adam, she was figuratively taken out of his heart. Eve was actually part of man, and she therefore by nature had a much closer empathy and dependency on Adam than the animals. And this of course ought to be naturally reflected in our marriages. But what can we deduce then about the different natures and the abilities of Adam and Eve in Genesis, who were created with different roles in mind? Verse 15 of chapter 2, Adam was asked to dress and keep the Garden of Eden. In other words, to work within it and to guard, protect and develop it. And when we consider the types again, trees depicted individuals, didn't they? You think of Isaiah 41, Isaiah 55, for example. So there is a spiritual implication that he was responsible for building and nurturing a godly family, bringing them up in the nature and admonition of the truth. And we find out that this is actually borne out in the words of chapter 1 and verse 28, when they were blessed and told to be fruitful, multiply, and to replenish or fill the earth, both physically with their own family, and also spiritually by implication of the types. In fact, this is one of the key objectives of marriage, I'm sure we all know. It's the building of the house of the Father for glory to his name. And Eve was asked to help Adam in all this. She was his helpmeet, which required her voluntary assistance. Otherwise there would be friction between them. And importantly, she would have been contradicting the Father's direct instruction when you think about it, and his will on the matter. When we go to consider the fall, we notice in chapter 3 and verse 6 that it was Eve who was misled when the serpent in verse 4 and 6 conveyed to her his thinking on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Verse 4, and the serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as the Elohim, knowing good and evil. And so the serpent deduced that the father must be quite wrong. For surely Adam and Eve would become just like the Elohim if they ate of the tree of good and evil, knowing good and evil in the same way. And secondly, that since the Elohim was still alive, having of course eaten of the same tree, then surely Adam and Eve would also be able to continue to live. He was wrong, of course. There was much more involved. And so he subtly explained that the father didn't really mean what he said. In reality, he made the father out to be a liar. And so being deluded, in verse 6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, the lust of the flesh, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, the lust of the eye, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, the pride of life, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. It's well known that the men and women in the main think differently, that the different areas of the brains are interconnected and are triggered in different ways. Women in the main tend to think more intuitively, more emotional, shall we say, and sympathetically than men, whereas men are often more logical and more reasoned. And it seems to me that Eve's decision was based more on emotion than Adam's would have been. And the words of 1 Timothy 2 verse 14 would perhaps tend to confirm that, because it says Adam was not deceived whilst Eve was. And therefore it's reasonable to assume that Adam could have steered them both away from the situation had he been consulted beforehand. And it seems to me that Adam, as the head of the house and who had been given dominion over the animals, ought to have had more control over the serpent, not permitting it the freedom and the opportunity to mislead his wife. He also ought to have ensured Eve was strong enough spiritually to perceive the dangers and the subtlety of the serpent thinking, and to give it a wide berth, as it can be implied by the word touch in verse 3. But if Eve was subjecting herself to Adam, surely she wouldn't have taken of the fruit without discussing it together with her husband, the head of the house, because it was clearly something that would affect them both in a big way. What a huge mistake, having such big consequences for them both and their offspring. Wasn't it essentially selfish of Eve? And sadly Eve, in her own mind, was actually making Adam subservient to her, contrary to the Father's will. And so surely a couple ought to try and understand one another's different abilities, their strengths, their weaknesses, and to amiably cooperate one with the other in love, using their respective strengths for the mutual benefit of the truth, themselves and their families. Wouldn't it have been better for Eve to amiably leave Adam to think logically through the issues and then together discuss it before taking a joint big decision? And clearly it's important that a wife would never feel oppressed or ruled by her husband. Her submission should be entirely voluntary, not enforced. And of course this would make much more easily for her if her husband was to lead appropriately in a loving way, just in the same way that the Master has led the Ecclesia in love. And we respect the Master because of what he's done for us. The principles he lived by are altogether lovely, aren't they? Good, just and true. And we naturally, with a free will love, wish to help him on the same basis, complementing and complying with his wishes as his faithful helpmeet. And if we don't have the same values and think the same way, then surely we strain the relationship that we have with him. And so Adam, in verse 6, having become weaker in the relationship than he ought to have been, he voluntarily, knowing what he was doing, he'd actually thought about this, he gave his life for his wife. He took the fruit from her so that he could be with her, support her, looking after her, keeping her company and her love in the new situation, regardless of the consequences. He knew, dying thou shalt die. And so he loved his wife, as Paul exhorted, didn't he? Giving his life for her, quite literally. I wonder whether we would do the same, brethren. How sad it would seem that both made such big mistakes, and that the consequences were so great for both of them and their extended family. After taking the fruit, they felt quite naked, and so we understand they were both equally responsible to the law, as we are in the truth. And the Elohim answered, chapter 3 and verse 11, Who has told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not? Again notice that there is an order. Adam, then Eve. Notice they are rather pointedly addressed here as man and woman, which emphasises, of course, that it was Adam who was taken out of the ground, whilst Eve was taken out of the side of the man. But when they made their replies, notice verse 12, how very wrongly both Adam and Eve tried to shift the blame from one to the other, instead of admitting to their own failure and responsibilities. Like Adam and Eve, the Master will judge us by the things that we say when he comes, and the things that we have done. And if we respond in the same way as they did, I certainly don't believe that we will be acceptable to him. Can you imagine representing the Father as kings and queens in judgment over the nations in the future, if we fail to determine the real issues and pass judgment on both from Adam, as both Adam and Eve did here? It just won't happen, will it? Just ponder what Adam says here for a minute. The woman thou gavest me. Oh, how quick he is to falsely blame the woman. But more importantly, he's pointing the finger at the Elohim. Wasn't it the Elohim who had given him the woman as a blessing? And so doesn't Adam effectively blame them and deride the God-given provision that he had been made and been given him? How dangerous and ungrateful he really was. Wasn't it Adam's responsibility to encourage and build his wife's understanding so that she didn't make such a mistake? He didn't seem to have, and so some blame actually rested in that respect back on Adam. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to blame Eve. She gave me of the tree and I did eat. And whilst those might be accurate words, they are nevertheless deceitful, because they imply that he didn't think before he took the fruit from her, and that he'd simply done as she said. And yet we know from 1 Timothy 2 and verse 14, it says he wasn't deceived. And so Adam must have thought clearly about it. It's these kind of things which cause the greatest trouble in a marriage, in a household, in the ecclesia, in any relationship. If we can't be honest and open with one another, avoiding deceit, some lies, small lies perhaps, white lies, no engineering of situations, avoiding any form of deception, living up to our respective responsibility without passing the blame on to others. If we don't trust and respect slowly and quicker evaporates, and rifts arise, causing fundamental problems in a marriage and in a family and in ecclesia. The Father exhorts, doesn't he? Be ye holy, for I am holy. It's not optional when you think about it. In all these difficulties, it's important that we learn how to behave, how to build one another up, encourage one another, and when our partners fall short of the mark, as we all do, we continue to build and to lift them up for the next occasion. It's so easy to knock down. Another thing that particularly gripes me, I'm sure I'm not alone, but how often do you hear somebody say that they will do something and they don't? Worse, promise and they don't. Yet our yea should be yea and our nay a nay, keeping our word and more importantly our promises. And I often flip the coin the other way up and wonder how we would feel if the Father didn't keep his word. Imagine that. He changed his word and blamed us for something that we hadn't done. So again, why would we think that we can represent the Father in the millennium or be the Master's faithful loving bride if we can't keep our word? Verse 13, the woman is then challenged and she then blames the serpent, and without thought goes on to quickly admit that she hadn't questioned or thought about the serpent's suggestion. But she also lied, because we are told that she saw, she desired, she took. She must have thought, but she was carried away by her lusts. Perhaps she's being a little bit more honest than Adam, because she was actually deceived. Verse 14, when it comes to the serpent, he had pontificated on something he didn't fully understand. Being wrong and effectually, he made the Father out to be a liar. Although he wasn't responsible for the law like Adam and Eve, he nevertheless suffers for misleading Eve, for he was then to crawl on his belly on the ground and eat the dust of the ground. In verse 16 through to verse 19, judgments of sorrow are passed on Eve, first and then Adam. And in verse 16 we find that the woman's sorrow was to be greatly multiplied, whereas Adam's isn't. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children clearly refers to childbirth. Her desire or her longing would now be to her husband, and he would have dominion over her. So her emotional and physical dependency on Adam would now appear to have become deeper, and it would form part of her sorrow. Verse 17, and to Adam, because he had hearkened unto the voice of his wife rather than the Father, he would now provide for his wife and family in the sweat of his brow. And it would seem that the man to me was made physically and emotionally stronger so that he could fulfill that role and provide for his family. And so we see in the judgments made on them their different roles and their dependencies were emphasised. Eve was to bear children and her desire would be to her husband, and so it would seem that she was blessed with a softer, warmer nature that made her more sympathetic and more suited to her role of supporting her husband and children, helping to raise her husband's family. Both roles in the wisdom of the Father were equally necessary and vital, but they are different. Well, changing the subject a little bit now, what should our approach be if things start to go wrong in a marriage? Well, we ought to start talking, didn't we? And agree the spiritual principles between that are affected. And then I think it's most important that we allow a bit of time for the emotions to catch up. Let's go back to our reading there in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 1. And there we find that wives can potentially, in such circumstances, win their husbands by their spiritual example. And in principle, of course, this applies the other way round to the husband. It's by their manner of conversation, by their reverence to the truth, and by her being subject to him, or the other way round, rather than leaving one another. Verse 1, likewise ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, and so that could be somebody now within the truth or out, they also may without the word be won by the conversation or manner of life of their wives. Verse 2, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear or respect. Verse 3 continues, whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on of apparel. So her focus was not to be on her natural beauty, which mars, of course, with age. But verse 4 says her heart should be with the ornament, should be endowed with the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And equally, it's the approach a husband should adopt if the problem is the other way round. I think that's lovely, though, winning somebody back in wisdom by showing love and by example. And note it's something that Peter believes is essential. It's not optional. Just think for a moment about our relationship with the Master. Would we ever think of contradicting him, subverting him, arguing with him, being demanding, being angry or throwing a temper at him? I think not. So if we think of our marriages being the same relationship, in the same way as we ought, then why would it occur to sisters to do the same with their husbands? Or even the other way round, a brother in the truth. Surely they would be quite wrong to be speaking to them out of turn. And so a brother perhaps ought to think about the way the Master addresses us before he misbehaves with his wife. The examples, of course, there are for us. And in this context, I often think of the words of Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 11. I just ponder them over and over and over at times, which are so lovely. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. I think that's beautiful. And then my mind would go to Isaiah 50 and verse 3. And there it talks of the Master getting up morning after morning, every morning, learning, in order to be able to speak the right word at the right time. Something that we should all be striving to learn. So it's important never to let the sun go down without resolving any difficulty there might be between us. Talk and talk and talk. Talk again openly. Discuss the right way and say good night lovingly. Marriage is a continual adjustment, but it should never be hard work or something that we need to work on. You hear those phrases sometimes. I never had to work on mine. If it is, there just seems to be something wrong to my way of thinking. It doesn't require both. It requires both to help one another selflessly in the truth, and to encourage one another in their spiritual well-being. And I know it can be difficult. We see it in some relationships. Quite difficult for an intelligent sister, for instance, to learn how to sensibly raise an issue with her husband or her brother who's perhaps less able in that particular respect. But doing this should still be done in a way that respects the roles and the responsibilities of one another. And similarly, there are other issues. A husband raising an issue with his wife tactfully can require some skill. so it doesn't become personal and offence isn't taken, without being overbearing as well. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6 says, "Let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer every man." Going back to 1 Peter 3 and verse 5, it now continues, "For after this manner in the old time the holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being subject unto their husbands, even as Sarah obeyed her husband Abraham, calling him," means publicly, "Lord, whose daughters ye are, as well as you do, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement." So even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him publicly Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as you do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. And the inference here, of course, of these words is that if a wife doesn't submit to her husband, as Sarah did, then they wouldn't be suitable for marriage with the master. Rather strong words when we think about them. I personally don't think the scriptural position of our sisters is demising in any way whatsoever. It's actually a lovely role that the Father has blessed them with. And I'm very glad, and I'm sure every brother thinks the same way, that we're very blessed to have such suitable complementary companions. They are a blessing of the Father to have the loving submission, gentle cooperation in our homes, for having the loving submission, the gentle cooperation in homes, for them to teach and bring up our children in the nature and the admonition of the truth when the husbands are at work. And it's a wonderful privilege that a brother doesn't normally have. I also believe we can't emphasise enough how important it is for wives and sisters to grow in the Spirit Word. It isn't the sole preserve of husbands. It's the responsibility of both to build themselves up so that they can help one another and encourage one another, their family, the ecclesia. It will affect their eternal welfare. It's a huge responsibility and surely a wonderful privilege for a wife to help tender a husband's trees, just like Adam and Eve in the garden, and to help build a family for the glory and honour of the Father. And sometimes when we look about the ecclesia, it can take the perception of a sister to spot someone who's having difficulties or an issue. A brother doesn't even see it. And then jointly work out who is the most appropriate of the two to follow the matter up in the right way. How often a sister can be more effective in supporting the widow and the fatherless, visiting if necessary, and providing a shoulder for those who would benefit from sharing something in complete privacy in a sympathetic way. Enthusing one another with word and the current signs of the times, which can't be difficult at present, can it? And when we think of our youngsters who perhaps are beginning to look for a partner, how often do we select a partner? Often just on physical attraction. And sometimes very little else matters, quite sadly. Didn't we ought to find someone who has common values, objectives in the truth, someone who simply wants to help build the Father's house to the glory of the Father's name, which is actually the prime objective of marriage? Yes, of course, we are flesh and are attractive to different types of people. But if the essentials are not there, then we ought to walk away and put our trust in the Father, knowing that He will provide someone suitable for us at the right time. Well, let's start to bring our thoughts to a conclusion then. In summary, didn't we ought to respect the order the Father has placed on us? Respect the equal capacity we both have for understanding divine things. Submit to one another. Learn to use our different benefits and strengths for the glory of the Father, that the fullness of the Godhead also might dwell within us, and share together in the hope set before us. And you know, I've thought about this quite a lot. Just like a normal husband to be, let us not be deluded that the Master will know at his return whether we are genuine brides, having a genuine love for him, or whether we are selfishly looking for what we can get from the relationship, to be kings and priests for eternal life, as it were. He will know whether we are purely motivated by our love and respect for him, and whether we have been genuinely preparing ourselves for him in love, loving the same things, thinking and behaving in the same way, having the same values of mercy, gracious and true. If we don't, and if not, I don't believe for 1 second that he will want us as eternal wife. Would you? I think the answer is obvious. Just come with me for a few minutes as we conclude to Song of Solomon chapter 4. Again, another one of my favourite chapters, if we're allowed or permitted to have them. Song of Solomon chapter 4 and verse 8. It shows the love that there will be between the Master and his bride. And it speaks of a time after their marriage when the Master takes his bride to the top of Mount Hermon, some 10,000 feet above the Galilee. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Amana, from the top of Shirna and Hermon. It's all the same mountain. There they sit together, overlooking their joint inheritance, the land laid out before them. And he looks into her eyes and tells her what he loves about her. 7 things are listed in verses 1 to 6 about what he loves about her. Things she has lovingly prepared for him in her life. And he says to her, verse 9, Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thine ointment than all spices. I think that's lovely. A true love story. What a lovely hope we have, brothers and sisters, provided we use the time left to us wisely and let the fullness of the love of the Father dwell within us bodily.